Welcome back to Close Up. It's been a year and a half of debate, deliberation, and work behind the scenes, but it appears lawmakers, police, and activists have reached common ground on a new model for handling complaints of law enforcement misconduct in New Hampshire. Two matching pieces of legislation are in the House and Senate. The House has already given its initial approval to its version, and the path to the governor's desk at the moment appears to be fairly clear. Here this morning to discuss the changes this bill would create are John Skippa, the director of the Police Standards and Training Council, and Joseph Lescaz, the Smart Justice Campaign Manager for the ACLU of New Hampshire. Thank you both, gentlemen, for joining us. And there's a lot to this legislation, particularly when it comes to adding some key definitions to the law. The new committee would be able to consider not just discriminatory conduct, but also racist statements as potential misconduct. Mr. Lescaz, how important of a step is that in your view?
Thank you, Adam, for the question. That's a very important step. Over the last couple of years, we have seen situations in New Hampshire where community members have made complaints over racially charged situations involving law enforcement, as well as we did see a situation in Manchester that was really egregious and impacted a lot of community members. So this addition of this definition of racist statements and conduct really will be impactful for the community. And I think that what it does is it also sends a message that law enforcement will take those type of situations extremely serious.
And Director Skippa, the existing council handles these complaints now, but this new proposed committee would really bring more people to the table. You'd go from 2 to 4 members of the public. You'd add a police officer below the rank of lieutenant and also a New Hampshire-based professor of criminal justice. How do you envision these added perspectives changing the process?
That's an excellent question, Adam. And I think an important thing to understand is that this legislation creates a specific committee to look at allegations of police misconduct, in addition to changing the composition of the Police Standards and Training Council. And I think it's important for folks to understand that the council not only addresses allegations of police misconduct during hearings and then makes decisions based on the facts that are presented, but the council also helps direct curriculum development, financial planning, budgeting. They are, in essence, the overseers of this entire organization. And the body that I answer to as the director of this agency. So there's a lot more that goes to the responsibilities of the council that are even more far-reaching than this particular notion of addressing police misconduct in a more contemporary way.
So a lot will go into this for sure. I think just getting to the bottom line, Mr. Lescaz, do you think this will bring the accountability that so many have been talking about since these conversations began back in 2020?
I think that it's going to bring a lot of the accountability. I don't know if it's going to bring all. When we look at the original LEAC recommendation that this piece of legislation originated from, there were some other provisions in it that I feel would really move the needle forward on accountability in our state. But make no mistake, these accountability measures that are going in place are definitely an improvement to what we have in the state. This definitely will help our community members, and Granite Staters really deserve this because when you go through this legislation and you see the things that are being created where nothing existed to begin with, I do believe that it's really setting us on the right track to giving the community members in our state exactly what they need when it comes to accountability, transparency, as well as looking to repair the relationship with law enforcement and marginalized community members.
Director Skippa, you testified before a Senate committee recently that you think that if and when this committee comes into being, you're going to see an increase in the number of complaints initially. I'm questioning how far back can you look? If someone comes forward with an allegation of racist conduct that's, say, a decade old, and that officer is still serving out on the streets, do you think it's important to look at that allegation?
That is something that we discussed at the committee level when we were trying to put this legislation together. Ultimately, the way the bill is written is that there is some very clear guidelines as to when complaints can be received and how far back we will go. Again, this is new ground, and I'm sure that there's going to be, if in fact this bill goes through, there will be somewhat of a learning curve as we apply these new proposed techniques to uniformly address these types of allegations.
And Mr. Lescaz, this is kind of the balancing act here, isn't it? Obviously, you want to stamp out bias and discrimination, but officers still have due process when they face an allegation as well. If an officer did make, say, a racist comment a long, long time ago, but has since then had a spotless record and maybe even is good in the community, do you think that officer should face investigation and potentially sanction?
That question really, I think, drives a point home that we need to really consider, which is when a person has done something in an official capacity, because what you're speaking about would speak to an officer in their official capacity using that type of speech or language or conduct. That what we have to take a look at is what is the impact that that's having on the community for their faith in law enforcement or in that department. What impact does that have also on that department's effectiveness or that officer's effectiveness in the community? Those are two things that need to be considered. I think that when we look at deeds that are done, like everyone is responsible for their actions, and there is consequences to every action. And I myself know this, that regardless of whether or not a person may have a spotless record afterwards, there's still consequences for the actions that we have done from years prior. And that's just life. So I think that what would have to happen is there would need to be an investigation to make sure that this situation was resolved, that the community members that were impacted by those actions have a say in the matter. And then I really think that it's up to that community to look at whether or not that officer would still be effective, or if they have the trust in his ability to be an effective law enforcement official in that jurisdiction. I personally do not see how individuals who are held to the standard that law enforcement officials are would still be able to operate in an official capacity in New Hampshire law enforcement when making racist conduct or speech. And I think that we saw an example of some law enforcement officials standing up to that in Manchester over the Aaron Brown situation.
A huge part of this conversation as well is use of force. Director Schiappa, I'm interested in your perspective here. You noted before the training aspect is a huge part of this, and because the council operates statewide, you get to have a say in terms of how police officers are trained around the state. But do you think this new committee will change anything about how use of force, or particularly when excessive use of force comes up, how that is looked at in New Hampshire?
I'm not sure that I understand your question now.
Well, to the point of, people are concerned about these things that have happened around the country. Obviously, the impetus with the murderous use of force in the George Floyd situation. But do you think how the state approaches police use of force will change as this committee comes into being?
No, I don't believe that the formation of this committee and the establishing of new process in terms of how these things get reviewed will or should have any impact on the use of force laws that exist here in New Hampshire. The use of force laws here in New Hampshire are very sound. They provide very clear guidance to the officers in a way that provides those officers the opportunity to defend themselves and innocent third parties without having to wait to be assaulted or hurt. So, to that end, I think really the review committee will provide a more clear and more defined way on how these things get reviewed. But I don't believe that the standards with regard to the use of force under RSA 627.5 will be impacted at all.
I do want to get to one key aspect of this piece of legislation with you, Mr. Lescaz, and that is this committee will have investigatory power. What does that do, in your opinion, in terms of allowing the committee to conduct an investigation of an investigation?
So what I think that it does is well, we have to, before we even get to that, we have to look, right? So this review committee now has public members as a part of the review process when looking at police investigations. So one, that's, to build community trust, but also is to make sure that the community is involved in seeing whether or not our law enforcement officials are not only acting the way that they should be, but if making sure that police departments are doing their due diligence in conducting investigations. You see that the increase of public membership went up 100%. It went from 2 to 4. It's only 2, but it's still 100% increase. And this body being able to conduct investigations, the original recommendation actually made it so that this body would be able to conduct investigations on their own. This legislation actually kind of dialed that back, where it doesn't allow them to conduct investigations on their own unless certain criteria are met. There's safeguards that are in place, and I think that being able to review police departments' investigations to make sure that they were done the way that they were supposed to be, while having public input and the public's eye on that process, I think that will that's going to I think that's going to create a more efficient process for these hearings, for these the disciplinary hearings that happen at PSTC, but I also think that it's going to create a process by where the public can start to trust these investigations.
And just about 30 seconds left, I want to give you a quick question here, Director Skipa. Do you think this new committee, if it comes into being, helps or hurts recruiting?
I think that this will have no bearing one way or the other on the recruitment of police officers and corrections officers here in this state. I think that the landscape of where law enforcement finds itself right now, to include, pay, benefits, work environment, these things which have always existed with regard to the recruitment and retention issues, those are always there. I think that, ultimately public sentiment and maybe some of the changes that are occurring in our profession are probably having some negative impact. I don't believe that those types of issues are occurring here in New Hampshire, but in a national dialogue, I think that it is negatively impacting the ability to recruit and retain good police officers. The hope is that our profession has always been very robust. We're dedicated to this honorable profession, and those good people that make up New Hampshire law enforcement are going to continue to move forward, continue to hold themselves and each other to the highest standards, and the landscape will change. And we will continue to do a good job here in New Hampshire for the people of New Hampshire.
All right, Director Skipa and Mr. Liskaz, we appreciate your time on Close Up. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.